I am really glad to introduce to you Shastri Nick Kranz and his wife Jade, who are here with us today and very dear friends of mine. Nick has been a student of Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, and I probably got that really wrong, but they're the only ones who know, probably. Since 1997, he has developed an approach to cultural transformation with the practice of social meditation and has worked with youth leadership development in the Shambhala community for the last decade. He brings the wisdom of meditation practice to business and organizations with his website, mindfulinthemist.com. He is interested in the intersection of social entrepreneurship and collaborative right livelihood. So please welcome Nick Kranz.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. So it's really truly an honor to join you and see what you've got going on here. I think, in terms of being human beings on planet Earth, religion is various summations of what is meaningful and purposeful to us and how we share that with others. So it's a profound medium. And, this particular tradition from which I come from, the Shambhala Buddhist tradition, has its origins from Tibetan Buddhism. It is sort of what you would call a sort of a new emergence of the way that this tradition is evolving in the West, and having left Tibetan culture, which was essentially kind of like a Bronze Age little pocket, a time untouched for about 1,000 years. They had pretty strong development of their culture, and since they have spread out around the world, many different versions of how to make those particular religious teachings and spiritual teachings relevant have emerged. So in particular with the Shambhala tradition, the namesake refers back to a mythical, or you could say real, depending on your belief, kingdom that existed. Sometimes they say in the Himalayas, sometimes they say the furthest east and the farthest west meeting. There are people who felt that it was a real place at a time. But the idea behind it is that it was a place where the citizens actually were very diverse. They weren't all Buddhists. The original king, King Suchandra in Sanskrit, or he would be Dawa Sangpo in Tibetan, he actually was the ruler of a kingdom that had principles based on religious principles of Buddhism, but that was tolerant of many different religious groups. The second king of Shambhala, Jakpal Trungpa, he was actually responsible for creating what was called sort of the one class of all citizens being equal in their basic goodness, or their original goodness. So despite their different belief systems, they he really wanted to minimize that kind of influence culturally of a caste system. So personally, these stories from the past have a lot of meaning to me today because they're about human beings trying to create a good world right now. They're not just stories of, historical lore, but they live within the heart of anyone who cares about creating a society that is based on our highest principles. And so this notion of basic goodness or original goodness has a lot of different sort of correlates in Buddhism. There's the notion of Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha, which means the essence within each consciousness or of any living being, that they have this connection and potential to completely understanding what it is to be alive, and in doing so they could realize their full potential and attain enlightenment. So that everyone has that potential to unveil or reveal their innate awareness that is beyond notions of self and other. a vast awareness, an awareness that you could say is a cosmic or primordial awareness. So this is talking about the nature of living beings, but then we have the aspect of people, and we're complex, and we're very diverse in our points of view and our emotional makeups. So the notion of this nature as being distinguished from aspect is really important. There's other ways in the Buddhist tradition that you could see the ground or history for a notion of basic goodness or original goodness. In the Tibetan tradition, you have the notion of kadak, which ka is the first letter in the Tibetan alphabet, and dak is, a sense of purity, completeness. Kadak can be translated as primordial purity. So this is a fascinating notion that before, almost a beginningless notion, before any time you could even say began, that there is no beginning, actually. There's no end. And that this primordial nature, this primordial goodness, is the nature of all living beings. So if that's true, then why is it that we don't just automatically have enlightened behavior and societies emerging everywhere spontaneously? Sounds good. It's a nice story. But when we look at our world, we see a lot of struggle. We see a lot of aggression and violence, and we have throughout the history of humanity. So this premise is again referring to the nature, the fundamental potential of being alive. What is it that is alive? As we are here together in this very moment, what is it that's aware? What is it to be alive? And having a contemplative tradition in Buddhism where there are tools through meditation and prayer and chanting that people become familiar with their own mind, and through that they start to understand what is basically true, or what is the enduring condition. Not what's true, last week, but no longer is true this week. What is true and will always be true. And that personal journey or exploration is the point of these methodologies or techniques or tradition of passing on meditation and prayer. So it's a very personal journey that particularly the Shambhala Buddhist and in general Buddhist tradition asks of its practitioners, that they examine for themselves what is true. Historically, Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, said that, you shouldn't believe what I say. Test out my teachings as if you were testing out gold. See if it's true for you. But in order to do this, there is a sense of journey or a path that is presented for people wanting to evoke this inherent goodness that is spoken of, but that we don't necessarily see spontaneously appearing in the world. So the journey of proposing that there's original human goodness, it may sound very nice and very humanist, very positive about the potential of humanity, but it's not naive to the struggles of humanity, and it's not in opposition to those. A lot of times what we find is that while we're living our lives, we have all sorts of personal burdens and challenges, psychological knots, you could say, ways in that we get stuck or hung up or frustrated. And working with those individual challenges actually is the way in which we extend compassion to others. We work with our own sense of understanding our own mind, and through that, we begin to see the universality of the challenges that we're facing as human beings. When we look at acts of terrorism or violence and acts where an individual is not considering or caring for the welfare of another human being, those actions can easily be sort of ascribed the value of that person is under the influence of great confusion, great misunderstanding. If we believe that people have the potential to understand their own being and their own mind, then what is that journey? Is it possible for people who are under the sway of incredibly negative emotions and negative points of view, is it possible for that to change? Anecdotally, we could say in our own lives, when we encounter someone who's under a lot of challenge or facing incredible difficulties personally or socially and societally, maybe they've had very difficult circumstances, we can see that some people don't particularly change and evolve and learn how to shed negative behaviors. Thus, again, the fact that we don't have a peaceful world, a world that is, you could say at a point of self-understanding that violence is seen as not an option, period, right? We haven't achieved that as a collective. And individually, anecdotally, we might look at people and say, well, I've known people who have had challenges and they haven't overcome them. But that's not necessarily proof that people can't develop and change. It's a case-by-case situation of saying, oh, maybe that person doesn't have the tools, maybe that person doesn't have the willingness to engage in things that might help them overcome some of their negative behaviors and hang-ups. And when we come back to the individual journey and we're looking at our own behavior and our own psychology, on a very micro level, we can see that the pain and the way that we get stuck and the way that we get frustrated is in essence no different on any scale of human behavior. It's the same basic pattern. We start believing we're right and others are wrong, and we stop entertaining an open mind, and our heart shuts down a bit, and we feel threatened by anything that doesn't confirm what we already know to be true on a conceptual level, and we start digging in our heels. Unfortunately, this doesn't produce a compassionate outcome. It creates more animosity. So even on a small level in our personal experience, we can see that getting stuck in negative states of mind or being frustrated by our own emotions or the behaviors of others, these things may not have drastic consequences because their scale is so small. But when we look at people, for example, with incredible pain and incredible fear about the destruction of their homeland, their inability to make a living, the aggressions that come from outside nations to their homeland. And if we put ourselves in their shoes and we think about the idea of, a drone hovering, and I just can't imagine what that sounds like. Bzzz, and it's out there, and your aunt is, in her room, doing, maybe she's cleaning something, and she looks out and she sees it there. And she goes to bed and she hears it. And she wakes up in the morning and she hears it. And she wonders, are you hanging out with those people again? She's worried about you. Are you next door? She's calling out for you. Please come home. And at some moment, out of the blue, 3 days later, a strike is made because there are some radical people doing have been watched to be doing potentially very dangerous things that will harm other people. So a choice is made from a remote location. And the pain and anguish of that terrorizing situation, two wrongs do not make a right. And so it's a very complicated and painful position we're in at this point in the world, where further aggression will lead to further aggression. And so the notion of original goodness is not that if everyone will behave themselves, then we'll believe it. That would be too easy. That would require no bravery. And it wouldn't be compassionate. If you're waiting for people with great confusion and great fear to start behaving in a different way, you can wait as long as the sun and moon will rise and fall. So, being an active participant in a compassionate approach to being in the world is the path of working with challenges, working with difficult emotions in ourselves, on the microcosm, and on the macrocosm, remaining with an open, kind heart towards all the different possible points of view that are out in the world. Because unfortunately, when you have 7.5 billion people, soon to be 10, maybe 14, there's going to be about that many different points of view. Literally, we occupy different spaces in this physical space. We are seeing different things right now. Might be somewhat similar. What we see is, from our point of view, is actually true for us. And it's also true for someone else. So there's this incredible vastness that we're in. And this relates to the notion of primordial, the vastness of being alive and being on a planet full of life with different points of view. This is connected with something that is accommodating and allows for all this diversity. It allows for us to make choices. It allows for us to learn. So the primordial aspect seems to make some sense, but then this notion of purity, why would we say primordial purity or basic, fundamental goodness? And here, this notion of goodness is joining the absolute nature of things, this vast space of reality, with the relative conduct of a good heart. Because that good conduct is in accord, it's in harmony with that vast nature of goodness. It's a relative manifestation. It's, I think the notion of virtue, you could say, is being in accord with what is already true about things, rather than fighting reality. That would be a notion of delusion. So I think in sort of encouraging this viewpoint around remaining compassionate and open-hearted, even in the face of incredible evidence to the contrary about human nature, is meant to be a conversation with people of faith and people who do not have a faith around how can we together as human beings create a world which fulfills all of our collective aspirations of being a peaceful, kind, and compassionate place. And certainly, giving up on that outcome or that possibility can't be in alignment with compassion. We can't say that, who cares what happens? Because in the moment of compassion, that's when we're on the spot for bravery too. Bravery and courage and nobility come from being willing to think of others, to think beyond our own personal pleasure and our own safety, and consider how we can be part of the solution. So in essence, this notion of original goodness of humanity, again, does not deny the confusion of humanity, but it points out that ignorance, not knowing how to take care of oneself, not knowing how to create good outcomes in the world, comes from not knowing. It's not a choice from on high. That someone actually has all the options. They have all the information. They choose to create harm. In the Buddhist tradition, it's said that compassion is actually the fundamental nature of being alive. Because when we actually let go of attachment and fighting with our own hang-ups and others' behavior, and we don't get caught up in that drama, when we relax and let go, we find that the natural state of the mind is there's no motivation in there to hurt or harm anyone. All that's left is openness, sensitivity, kindness. What else could be there? When you strip away all of the sort of personal, dramas and selfish motivations, and you let go of these things, what's really underneath all of that? What are we made of? Do we trust that if we let go into that, what we can find is that we're not monsters, we're not innately chaotic. In fact, we're not engaged in any kind of chaos at that level. We've unclenched the fist. So how could we hit anyone? Why would we move to strike another out of a space of not fighting and not needing anything? We're comfortable as we are. We've found a place of rest that exists within us, but we also see that potential in others. And that spark of seeing others' potential is a blazing kind of compassion, a fiery compassion of, I won't give up on you. My teacher's father, Trungpa Rinpoche, he had to escape Tibet when the Chinese were taking over the country. And at that time when he was escaping, people started following him. He was a High Lama in Tibet, and they thought, oh, he knows what he's doing. So people started following him. He said, no, don't follow me. We'll be a big group. We'll be easier to see. But they wouldn't listen. They said, no, we trust you. And as he was leaving, he saw his teacher, Khenpo Gangshar, walking alone directly toward Lhasa, which was such a courageous moment. Lhasa was under complete siege. Anyone who went there, especially a high-ranking official, would be tortured and killed. But he was walking there with no hesitation. That's the last time he saw his mentor. What a powerful message. He saw something deeper than just his own well-being. And he wasn't walking there for any other reason but to try to help the little bit he could. Trungpa Rinpoche escaped. He led 200 people to India, and they survived, most of them. It's really quite remarkable. And you would think that someone who had gone through, losing their entire culture, their whole family, their homeland. I don't know, I can't really say that I fathom that. I mean, if we all had to leave here and under duress and could never come back, and many of our family members were killed, I just can't imagine how intense that would be. But further than that, what really amazes me is that would be a person you could understand being quite bitter and who would say, you know what, humanity's just, they're in trouble. They're not worth fighting for. But he actually was notorious for saying, never give up on anyone or anything. And that is the spirit with which he spoke about basic goodness. From a place of such deep belief in the potential of humanity. And I think throughout history, people have been humbled by people with that kind of conviction and altruism. And I am. So while I'm an idealist, I'm not naive. I don't believe that we're going to, just quickly sort of fix all the problems in the world and have an enlightened societies popping up all over the place in sort of fast succession. But I think it's a fight worth having. It's worth not giving up on humanity. And people of religious faith in particular are being looked to and looked up to and saying, you believe in something. A lot of people are struggling with having a faith, some kind of principle that's bigger than themselves. At this time, we have more of these cell phones in the world than we do toothbrushes. And a lot of the time is spent, just sort of, oh, did anyone say anything nice about me? Do I have another update that someone cares about me? It's very concerning. There are young people that are growing up having conversations in a room but on their phones texting, but they could talk. So when people have something that gets them out of bed, that helps them see a bigger world, a world beyond themselves, this is an incredible opportunity to inspire others with an incredibly open mind that believes in the potential of people, regardless of just looking for short-term evidence in people's behavior. So with that, I would thank you for having me, and I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or insights or comments, please. Love to have a dialogue.
Hi, my name is Rachel and I come from China. As I listen to your perspective, I'm really touched, and I think I grew up in a Buddhist culture, and I see how various Buddhism is. And I also see the potential benefits of it. But also I have a question. I read sort of something about Buddhists. Also people been meditating. And the book is talking about they are trying to reach a status of calling, it's like unconditioning condition. So as you were mentioning a lot that you believe, and we all believe the potential of the goodness in people. Yes, we believe that too. But we also admit that in humanity, there's a stronger or heavier tendency to do evil than to do good. I would love to hear how you wanted to explain, or what's your perspective of that when you are trying to overcome the evil in humanity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. What a good question. How interesting. I think from the point of view of the Buddhist tradition, there's a notion of karma, and the karmic propensities that we have are sort of the unconscious seeds that have been planted and just come up. Do you notice them? You just sort of have thoughts come up, and maybe they're really horrible. You think something really bad about somebody, you go, you know? And this used to happen to me when I was a teenager a lot. I would be kind of nervous, and then when I was really nervous in situations, the worst thoughts would come up, like the thing you least want to think. And I was like, oh no. And then I'd get so upset with myself, and I would start to feel like, don't do that. Don't think that. But I didn't even think it. It just came up. I was like, ah. So I had to learn how to make friends with that I couldn't stop it from coming up. But if I tried to stop it, it got stronger, and then it went poof, like that. So meditation helped me to learn how to not fight with it. It comes up, ooh, ouch, that hurts. I don't want to think that. All right, let go. Don't fight with it. If I practice aggression towards my own thoughts, what am I training to do with others' thoughts? So it's not that we're going to overcome the negative tendencies all at once. And certainly there's a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding that comes up in our minds. But in this sense, the notion is that we practice in order to make incremental progress. We do our very best. We never give up on ourselves or others. And so each time we let go of a thought and don't fight with ourselves, or we're kind to ourselves when we think something that's negative, we say, oh, that's not what I mean. It's okay. It's just a thought. Don't add to it. Don't fear it. It'll make it stronger. Just relax and have compassion for your own thoughts, your own. It's interesting if someone else comes to us and we are to be compassionate to them, but they're behaving, really inappropriately. If we sort of reject them, there's not much compassion there. But if we can actually hold their pain and meet them with dignity and openness, That seems like the way forward, right? So if we first learn how to do that with our own thoughts, it's just training. So yeah, hopefully these things help humanity, right? Hopefully it helps. It's like another drop in the bucket to bring things back in balance. That's the aspiration.
Thank you for being here today. I love what you had to say about the inner peace that comes from someone who's true religious in the Buddhist perspective. And I think even as Christians, it would be that, Jesus' example, I think, would lead us the same way that we should be people of peace and rest. And yet there's this incredible divisiveness and hands-fisted, and even within Christianity. So I appreciate that you said that. And to her question, I've been speaking to a lot of people of various religious backgrounds, and I feel like there's a bit of a trend to say, well, I've just given up on this organized religion, given up on this organized religion. I'm either atheist, or the other thing is, well, I'm just Buddhist. And I feel like, so my question sort of two parts is, I know that Buddhism isn't just a throwaway. I mean, there really is an essence to it. And so in any of your dealings with people who are just saying like, oh, I'm just going to become a Buddhist if there's frustration there, if it's, okay, well, let me tell you more about it. But the other thing, we both of our faiths share an essence that there is an original good. We would say that our religion and our faith started out with the garden and God and creation, and it originally was good. And you mentioned, I can't remember the phrase, it was a primordial goodness. Yeah.
Kadak, or primordial purity. Yeah.
Right. So I was curious from the Buddhist perspective, if I was going to meet with you and say, okay, I think we both agree that there was this. How did we get here? In Christianity, we explain the fall and sin, but I know those aren't terms that a Buddhist would use. So how would you say we got from that primordial good to kind of where we are now?
Oh, that's such a good question.
That's not a challenge, just curious. I'm so ignorant.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much. It's a very astute and important question. The answer is somewhat confounding, but not at all unclear. It's that we haven't actually left. From the point of view of primordial purity, time doesn't really exist. It's a relative expression. When we think about the future, it's a thought we have now. When we think about the past, it's a thought we have now. Nowness is what you would call the eternally youthful present, or the primordial moment, meaning that this is the continuous Big Bang. It's a microcosmic of recreation and creation are happening constantly, simultaneously, always. Now, conceptually, that doesn't help us too much. But experientially, the purpose of coming to a more unconditioned mind through meditation is to be able to begin to see first nowness, to be present in our body and mind, to be truly here for our lives and for others. That's the power of presence and nowness. And then looking further at that nowness over time, we begin to understand the nature of nowness is actually timelessness. And then what we realize is that these negative thoughts are misunderstood purity. The purity itself is the thought that's arising. Even a negative thought is made of gold. It's made of awareness. It's made of freedom. It's not actually imprisoned. It's only imprisoned when we have a relationship to it that's animosity. When we can feel a person in great pain and actually hold their pain, we call that compassion. That's a hint toward it, right? If we can be compassionate, and I personally am very inspired by the life of Christ, and his example and the things he did are exactly the same kinds of courageous and compassionate actions that inspire me in the Buddhist tradition. And I have no doubt that he was able to open his heart in the way that he was and feel pain and not resent the pain, but to actually be totally connected with another person without resentment, with love. When we talk about love, it's really a mind devoid of aggression, right? So this is a very interesting meeting point on those sort of between compassion and innate goodness. It's not that there aren't relatively bad things happening. And also the Buddhist answer for that on a more relative level is confounding. They say, well, it's beginningless and endless, and people are ignorant of their own purity and their own goodness. So that ignorance perpetuates the bad actions. So on a relative level, it's kind of like, okay, kind of have to go to the absolute to make it make sense in some way. To answer your other question a bit, it's interesting. I'm on a forum for young, Dharma teachers, Buddhist teachers, Generation X, they call it Dharma or something. And one of the teachers posted, I just saw some article that it said, young people are identifying with unorganized religions like Buddhism or something. and this actually happened because the people were self-ascribing that value to the religion. There wasn't, obviously the religion is not saying it's unorganized, although any one of our given communities might argue that they're a little more disorganized than another. But that's not what they were referring to, right? And I think really it's actually a slightly sophomoric issue. I think that Buddhism's new in this culture at this time. It's growing. People are interested. But I think people are, if they're coming to it thinking it's not an organized religion, that's not actually true, right? What they're coming to, I think, is for different reasons, but I think it might, for some people, be in response to not being able to find a pathway in the tradition they grew up in. And some people find a pathway, right? But then again, there are second-generation Buddhists that I know who, they don't want to do what their parents did. So they're kind of finding other, they might be sort of, have some respect for it, they know about it, but they're not like avid practitioners, all of them, right? So I think that's more about human nature and sociology than religion on some level, but we'll see, right? We'll see in the next 50 years, it'll be really interesting if, one of my teachers, Khandro Rinpoche, she once said, gosh, people have so much respect for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, which is, she does too, I do too. He's an incredible being, incredibly compassionate. But she said, gosh, we have so much credit in the world because of him, but she's like, gosh, if they really get to know that we're just normal people, it'll be hard. They'll be like, oh, she's like, if they saw us, when we're not behaving well, we might not get so much credit,
Thank you. What's the biggest problem that you have with most Christians?
That's a great question. Well, I don't know that, Firstly, I have a lot of respect for the tradition. When my parents were not particularly religious. My father actually grew up in a Christian Science family. He was even briefly the president of the Christian Science Club at Harvard. He was really into it for a little while, and then he wasn't. My mother grew up Episcopalian and had some respect. She loved the singing, but wasn't particularly religious. My brother, when he was around, I think he was like 7, said, I want to go to Sunday school. They said, great. We're taking you. They take him, and he went for a little while, for a couple of months, and then at some point, he said, I don't want to go anymore. They said, okay. And then when I was in my 20s and became a Buddhist, they're like, wonderful. So in some sense, they really were inspirations to me in their open-mindedness and their appreciation of diversity. And so I didn't grow up with any particular indoctrination against any tradition. I think that where I see a challenge in interfaith dialogue is when the behavior of somebody in a tradition gets to a certain point where they use their tradition to justify not having an open mind. And that could include being Buddhist. I know, there are many Buddhists who might say, look down on other traditions because philosophically they think, mine is superior. And I think that's a temptation that plagues all religions, so it's not something I have particularly, as a problem with Christians. I don't really feel like I have a problem with other faiths. I appreciate them. But I think that that's a problem we all have. as people who believe in religion, is that when we find ourselves using our tradition to say we're better than others, that's very dangerous, you know? And I think it's subtle too. We might not say it that coarsely. I mean, we're sophisticated enough to say, no, it's not that I'm better, it's just that I'm right and they're wrong. And even if you feel like you're right and you really believe and have conviction in your tradition, as you should, you know, that's an important point. You really should. If you're doing this, you should really dive in and challenge your own doubts. I think that's an important thing for anyone. One of my teacher's fathers said, somebody asked him, what if your son wanted to be a Christian? And he said, well, then he should be the best Christian he can be.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question, because every religion faces a problem of contextualization, which means because for Tibetan Buddhism, originally from Tibetan, but in different levels, and some of the Tibetan religions, they combine with folk religions like Boni,
Yes.
and but also some of the higher Tibetan Buddhism for their meditation, like for Tantric. Even this kind of a practice are rejected in certain cycle of Chinese or Japanese Buddhism. So it's interesting for us to observe that in Western world, when you're facing these Buddhism ideas, you accept something, but seems like you also, I don't know what, for Tantric or Boni or other kind of things, what's your reaction, what's your idea about these kind of things?
Yes. You know, this is actually Tibetan Buddhism, you know, sometimes gets too much of a free pass, you know, 1,000 years of you know, all this culture, and people say, oh, what a great tradition. But really, it had lots of problems. And there was very strong sectarian division, you know, between 5 different sects at least. One of them didn't even get acknowledged to exist. And recently, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, no, they existed. You know, so, I mean, there was a lot of political fighting, and I think that's true in every tradition, in every religion around the world. We, similar to the last question, when a religion or tradition is utilized for purposes that are not at the highest aspiration, things go wrong, as they must, right? As they of course will, right? That's what all of our teachings say. So in a sense, what my view on it is that what happened just before the invasion of Tibet, there was a movement called the Rimé movement in Tibet, which is an ecumenical movement. And Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Tae did a compendium of called the Treasury of Knowledge. I think it's like, I don't know if it's 18 or 20, volumes, this huge thing. I only have a couple of them. But in this treasury, he went around Tibet and started writing down all of the different amazing practices and traditions. He said, this is incredible. And he had this wide mind, as did Patrul Rinpoche and others of that time. They saw that the really beautiful thing about their culture was also in the diversity. And the Bonpo tradition, it's so intermixed with certain parts of the Nyingma lineage at times that some Nyingmas would say, oh no, that's Bonpo. Others would say, no, this is part of our tradition. My teachers did this stuff. And so it becomes, there's so many lineages. With Chan Buddhism, interacting, with Tibetan Buddhism, they've even found Tibetan Buddhist scrolls that are all about Zen. So, and also Taoism in Western China and Eastern Tibet started to interact with the Nyingma school, and they started exchanging cultural and spiritual things. The Taoists would wear certain amulets to sort of signify different things, and the Nyingmas in that area started doing that and still do it from that area. So I think that it's almost like the best thing that could come away from an interfaith conference would be that people have, kind of a deep respect for each other's tradition and feel inspired by the inspiration of the other person for their tradition. And that's really where I come from at this point in time with my tradition. Shambhala, interestingly enough, is ridiculously ecumenical to the point that in Cape Breton, Canada, there's a Christian group, that practices the first 5 weekends of our Shambhala training, which is an overview of meditation practice. And in our tradition, you don't have to become a Buddhist, and you can go through many levels of training, and you're welcome. Everyone's welcome from every tradition. So I think that's something unique maybe in my tradition, but I think that spirit is really important as the world is getting smaller. That what is the essence of a tradition and of a faith tradition? What's the purpose? If it isn't benefiting people and developing a wider mind, then it's probably worth looking at it twice and thinking about how we're behaving. So it's very inclusive, my particular tradition. But there are sectarian, the things you bring up are very real. And, I think His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has been very wide-minded about it, but there have been cases where people might, include the ritual worship of a certain kind of deity or being that harms other people. Then he said, no, that's not Buddhist. He's drawn the line. If it violates the basic principles of the greater tradition, it's too far out of the bounds. But as long as the tradition is about compassion and learning and peace and care, wonderful.
Sorry, one more question. I was actually fascinated with the story that you shared of your teacher fleeing China to the northern India area and how he looked out his teacher going back into a city. I was actually wondering if he ever shared with you how come he didn't feel led to go follow his teacher back to that town.
Yeah, his teacher had told him, this is sort of, you could say, prophetic or at least prescient, but his teachers from a young age, far before the invasion, although there were signals of tensions and possible invasion for a long time, but they said, you are going to teach in Jusip Lingpa, or the land of great wealth, and you will be a teacher who teaches a sort of worldly and spiritual teaching that unites both the ordinary, you could say lay activities of a non-monastic person and the rich tradition that's come through there. They saw him that way from a young age. He was kind of a prodigy. At I think like age of 8, he was giving 6-month ritual initiations that go all day and are like so complex that it's like, he was 8? I mean, I was tying my shoes, but... So, I don't know, they saw a lot in him, and they also really felt that his destiny, so to speak, or his possibility was in sharing with the larger world, which was unusual in Tibet. They'd been very insular up to that point, but I think, were seeing the writing on the wall, and also, so he had a direct command, you gotta go. And so His Holiness the Dalai Lama assigned him to be at the school for young lamas in India for a while, and he got to taste that culture, and then he went to study at Oxford in London, got a scholarship, and studied Western philosophy, and was very fascinated with the modern world. I can't imagine, And from there on, he's now, our community has 200 centers all over the world and 5 land centers, and it's one of the larger Western Buddhist sanghas made up primarily, people native to this area. But it's a really interesting story. If you want to read more about his journey out, there's a book called Born in Tibet. And it's a kind of a wild ride about his point of view of leaving and escaping with the people that came with him. Yeah.
Hi, Nick. I have a question.
Okay.
Really know minimum about Buddhism, so I'm trying to pick up a lot of information here. It leads me into just questioning myself, my understanding about Buddhism. It sounded like that, Buddhism does not really involve faith in someone that's transcendent. It's more about really believing the goodness of humanity. And it also sounds like how to achieve that goodness is in various tools or processes or rituals. So would you say then that Buddhism is really putting the faith in this type of rituals, a process that depends on the human that's carrying on the practice? Is that basically what it is?
That's a wonderful summation. It is perhaps more complicated in just, not as was mentioned, Christianity is far more diverse in its number of sects and, different approaches. Maybe Hinduism's even more. I think it's the most. But Buddhism has many different approaches. As was mentioned, the Theravadan tradition is almost more of a tradition that believes in the original Pali writings of the historical Buddha, and they have somewhat different approaches. The Mahayana tradition that came from India it has a wide reach, and a lot of actually Vajrayana traditions, or the Tibetan consider themselves part of the Mahayana themselves, even though they practice other methods. But yes, in essence, though there are different approaches, some focusing more on individual enlightenment, of transcendence of the suffering of this world. But in the Mahayana teachings, the focus is on, that's fine. But actually, transcendence is only as useful as it is effective in being compassionate. What is transcendence? It is unlimited compassion. It's inseparable from compassion. So when we talk about this notion of a personal journey to something transcendent, we're not really transcending, we're actually fully coming into the world and understanding what is this fully. When we understand what this is fully, we can act compassionately. But you're right in saying that this is a tradition that about human beings have passed on from person to person all the way back 2,500 years ago to the historical Buddha. That is something they're very proud about in Buddhist traditions, that it's a living lineage that comes through human beings and is passed from human to human. That doesn't mean that they don't believe that there are, something equivalent to a kind of divine intelligence. They might, in the Buddhist tradition, there are notions of especially in the Vajrayana tradition, notions of deities. But they all have the same nature as the Buddha. They might be different manifestations, but they are said to be equally luminous and emptiness. So this fascinating diversity of point of view happens in Buddhism, but the basic thrust of it is that it is passed from person to person. And the rituals or practices that you mentioned, the meditation tradition, is something you learn. And it's really helpful to work with a teacher, because as you start doing it, there's a vast tradition of development. And to not have to reinvent the wheel and be able to speak with someone and say, what was your experience? And they say, well, try this. So it's a living dialogic tradition that way. Yeah.
Let's give Nick a hand.